Hello and welcome back to the program. My name is Michael Finney. Today I am joined by Daniel Romero. Would you like to say hello?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and give some background, as a developer or as a media expert?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the East Coast, moved out to San Francisco in 2013 to work in technology, something I'd always wanted to do. And when I first moved out to San Francisco, my friend from college at the time, my friend from college, Fred Ursum, who was co-founder of Coinbase, really kind of tried to convince me, hey, you should come and work at this company that I have, Coinbase. We just raised a Series A from Union Square Ventures, Fred Wilson, and I think this Bitcoin thing is going to be big. And I categorically dismissed it as a Ponzi scheme and didn't think anything of it. But when I was finally out in San Francisco for that first year, I found that all of these smart people I kept meeting all had an opinion on Bitcoin one way or another, and an understanding of it, and kind of wanted to debate the merits and the nuances of it. And I was a complete dope and hadn't even read the white paper. So I finally ended up reading the white paper. I think it was kind of December of 2013, and like many others, once I kind of read it cover to cover, which is not that long. I think it's like 8 pages.
Right.
I couldn't stop thinking about Bitcoin and kind of crypto. It really wasn't called crypto then. It was really Bitcoin, but the idea of like what a permissionless public blockchain, right? Like this kind of new type of computer, what things you could build with it. And at the time, this is pre-Ethereum, you actually had a bunch of people building stuff on Bitcoin itself with the very rudimentary programming language. I think, it's called script or whatever, that you can actually you can build some very basic versions of call it smart contracts on Bitcoin. I remember in 2014 there was a project called Lighthouse that a developer named Mike Hearn, who was pretty well known at the time, he had been at Google,
Definitely.
demoed at Bitcoin 2014 in Amsterdam, which I was at that conference as kind of like at that point I had actually joined Coinbase, and it was a Kickstarter built completely on Bitcoin, which is like a super impressive technical achievement. If building smart contracts on Ethereum is hard, like just imagine doing that on Bitcoin. And so I think in that era, it was really the kind of like ethos of Bitcoin was still very much of this is a completely new way to go build applications. And that was the promise that actually got me into crypto, is I thought we were on the precipice of a big wave in new consumer applications built on top of blockchains in the same way that, and remember, it's 2013, 2014, the kind of mobile revolution was only at that point 6 or 7 years old. So people were, I think, eagerly optimistic that this was the next platform shift, right? That maybe VR, like AI had already kind of gone through multiple boom bust cycles of like, oh, this is an overpromised thing. I think in 2014, right around when I was joining Coinbase, it was like chatbots. And those obviously are now a big thing again. But like at the time, like everyone was like, "Oh, the future is everything is a chatbot," and that didn't necessarily pan out. So I think that's how I got into crypto is kind of thinking that like we were going to be building all these new applications on top of at the time Bitcoin. And then for the first few years I was at Coinbase, it panned out very differently. Like Bitcoin really didn't go anywhere as a development platform. I think it solidified itself, and in some ways, it's the biggest mark to go after, is just kind of like an alternative version of fiat money, right? Like something you can actually opt out of the fiat system that isn't, a hard commodity like gold. But it was kind of during that period of the wilderness for Coinbase is when, Ethereum started to gain a little bit of traction, and that's, I think, where my attention since that period has shifted very much over to that original promise of being able to build new apps and services on top of kind of these new types of computers, public blockchains. And yeah, so that's my background in a nutshell.
I think you make some really interesting points about cycles there, particularly uh, mobile as a computing cycle, and then perceiving blockchains as a distributed computing platform in that way. And also the AI thing. Obviously, we're kind of in a new bloom for that right now with just all the LLMs that we're seeing kind of popping up, and also the visual stuff in regards to Midjourney and Stable Diffusion. I have my preferences for those things, and I think it's fine to go down all the different routes. Um, whether or not you like the language stuff or you like the graphical elements. And I think that the analog to that is really kind of what we've seen happen over the last 10 years with blockchains too, and that there are all these different flavors and distributions. I make the comparison to Linux in that sense, where they have kind of slightly different optimizations. Obviously, like what you were saying initially there in regards to Bitcoin and how it kind of had compute functionality, and then some of that's been stripped out of the BTC model and has been kind of moved over into different chains. Most notably, I would say Ethereum, and most successfully in regards to the smart contract stuff that goes on there, and recently, like the art community that's kind of popped up around that too. I think is it's hard to not mention those things. Where are you paying attention to the most in regards to Ethereum or in general blockchains? What's keeping your eye?
Well, I think I'm mostly spending time thinking about Farcaster, and so our current plan is to deploy the kind of permissionless version of Farcaster. We're still very much in a beta, in a kind of permissioned beta, in that you can't just go sign up for Farcaster. You need an invite right now, but eventually, hopefully by the end of this year, it will be a credibly neutral protocol that anyone can kind of go sign up and do whatever they want with. We plan to deploy that on Ethereum L1. So my general interest is in the EVM world, but really right now is Ethereum L1 because that's where we're going to be. But if I was to kind of say, like, separate, okay, Farcaster itself from, like, what do I find the most interesting in just like crypto land right now, I very much am interested in how the interplay between Ethereum L1 and other kind of EVM compatible chains, specifically, you call them L2s, but even like Polygon's ZK EVM and some of these other ZK attempts, like how that all just kind of plays out. Because I think that there was a meme in the last kind of up market, is that, oh, Ethereum can't scale, and so therefore we need completely new L1s that are focused on scalability. And where we are now, I think in the kind of down market, is you lose some of that sheen and hype that come with the people who are basically talking about the Ethereum can't scale because they have a better alternative. Now it turns out it's like, okay, the developer communities in most of those other ecosystems, not all of them, and I think it's still worthwhile for people to try building them. They're much more fickle, right? Like a lot of those people probably have pivoted to AI because they were kind of mercenaries. They were showing up because they thought that there was like a quick way to make money. Whereas I think you have what a lot of people in the Ethereum ecosystem that are interested in it is there's a little bit more of an ideological bent, and that's always a little dangerous because obviously you kind of get in something like, I don't know, toxic Bitcoin maximalism or something like that, and you can see even elements of that within Ethereum that aren't great. But I do think my point of view is that these blockchains are just going to take a while to really develop, and for the applications built with them to actually start to reach scale. And so in order for that to happen, you're going to just need some dedicated missionary type people who are just, they actually are there for the technology and kind of like everything about it, rather than, oh, can I make money in 12 to 18 months? And so that is the area that I'm most excited about. And I think generally, with everything going on in AI, and to be fair, I think it's justified in that there's some pretty amazing achievements and leaps of progress that we've seen in a very short period of time on the AI side. I mean, I've been playing around
Absolutely.
Midjourney a lot recently, and it's an incredible piece of software. And the fact the iteration year over year has just been incredible to look at, like a V1 or V2 version of Midjourney to, I think they're on V5 right now.
Yeah.
But going back to so where does my interest fall? Crypto, I think, is now starting to be sufficiently contrarian again, right? It's like been an easy punching bag for all of 2022 as asset prices came down, and then you have the FTX stuff, and but my sense is, like, if you're still willing to build in crypto right now, like, you're starting to show your ideological missionary type colors, which I think is a good thing. And B, it actually also is an indication that you're probably a little bit more of an independent thinker. Like, you don't need the validation of, like, whatever's popular on Twitter in your bio. And so I think, like, NFTs is a great example of this, where the people that are actually innovating on a new functionality with NFTs and just, playing around with new ideas right now are probably, like, if I was to bet on, like, where are we going to be 2 or 3 years from now, like, what is more mainstream, it will be the stuff that's happening right now. And this has happened in every crypto cycle that I've been through. This is my third. Is the people that still kind of, like, have enthusiasm and enjoyment despite the macro conditions in the market. That's the area to pay attention to. And so I think there's just a lot of interesting stuff right now happening with open editions and NFTs. And the idea that, like, okay, if gas fees come down because you're using an L2, like, what does it mean to kind of like a piece of content, right? And so obviously we have an implementation on Farcaster, but the idea of, like, okay, well, if you charge a little bit, even if it's just gas, that creates, by definition, scarcity relative to something that if it's just like a packet, it's effectively free. Does that increase signal, which is something that I think in any instance of social media, going back to Farcaster, you're looking for is, like, what new signals can you add into an algorithm that can help surface the best content? I'm not quite sure that, like, just because it costs money that will actually indicate quality. Like, in some ways, there could be very much adverse effects of that, but it's an idea space that I'm finding increasingly interesting to think about, and helps that, friendly with Jacob Horn and at Zora. And so I think a lot of, like, what he's thinking about, I kind of filter through my own lens of kind of trying to build interesting things that people actually want to use.
There's a couple different things that I want to address there. So the first is, I definitely agree with the S-curve maturity, cyclical nature of the blockchain space and what's happening there. Obviously, like, price as an index of interest, it's hard to delineate that, just because it obviously makes people open their eyes. But in terms of the development community, and specifically what is happening with Farcaster, inside of that community, you guys have a really strong developer community on that protocol. Obviously, the most notable piece there is Warpcast, which is the social network that I'm pretty sure is, like, the main team and main push of that team, as far as I understand.
Yeah, so Warpcast, technically the name of the company is Merkel Manufactory, and it's always a little tricky when you kind of go through a rebrand, but we effectively just say Warpcast now. But the if you kind of want to get the full story, Varun and I started the company, Merkel Manufactory. We're exploring a bunch of ideas, started working on an idea that at the time we were calling RSS Plus, named it Farcaster. And that was how could you make RSS, which is kind of this permissionless old school protocol for distributing information, more competitive with something like Twitter. And Farcaster kind of became the name for the protocol. And we had our first decision point of, should we be naming the protocol and the initial app, because we built the initial app, something different. And our point of view was, in the early days, it'd just be too confusing. It's like, okay, you literally are two of you and you don't have any users and you already have two brands.
Right.
And so we just called it Farcaster and Farcaster.
And well, three, because Merkel Manufactory would be another one.
Right. In terms of, well, that was just kind of the name of the company. I think calling the company Farcaster, there are trademark issues. Whereas a protocol, you can just kind of call it that, because no one owns the quote word, but you can have a trademark. So there's a little bit of inside baseball in that.
Yeah.
So basically, for the longest time, we were just like Farcaster, right? Like we're working on Farcaster, like the app is Farcaster, that's easy. Then we announced a fundraise last summer, and I think we wanted to be clear is like, there's a team building this and a company, and so Merkel Manufactory kind of got identified, and for a while we were just kind of referring it to the Merkel client, Farcaster client. But then we, especially in the last 6 months, we've had a whole bunch of other developers start building on the protocol. And we felt like it was not fair to those other developers that if this is supposed to be a credibly neutral protocol, just like Ethereum or email, then you shouldn't have an official app that's called like Ethereum or email on either of those things. And so the analogy I always give is email, you have Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail. People get the concept of like there are multiple different providers on top of this protocol. In Ethereum, obviously, you can use MetaMask or you can use Rainbow or Coinbase Wallet. Again, a client on top of protocol. Web browsers is another good example. But with Farcaster, like we wanted to make it clear, so we renamed the Merkel Manufactory developed Farcaster client to Warpcast. But I think over time, we'll just always say, the Warpcast team, Warpcast. And so Warpcast itself is 10 people, and half of us are working more or less full time on the client, like the actual app, and half of that team is actually the kind of like lead developers of the protocol, right? And I think part of that comes from the fact that when we kicked off the kind of initial beta after spending about 9 months working on the initial version, Varun and I knew that the underlying Farcaster protocol was very much like a MVP V1, and it was like, can we actually just prove that people are willing to use something even if it's rough around the edges? And that worked out pretty well. It took us about a year to like kind of like kickstart enough usage, but in doing so, got to the place where we realized, okay, here are all the things that we need to do to upgrade the underlying protocol, and so we did that, and we're in the process of kind of launching the core pieces of functionality from that. The first is called the Farcaster Hubs, which are technically live right now for a small group of developers, and they'll be permissionless, call it in May of this year. And then there are two other major milestones to getting the protocol upgraded is one, moving from testnet, where we are today, to Ethereum mainnet. And then the last one is to kind of drop the sign-up gating, which I think we kind of have a high-level idea on how to go do this, but I think we're really sensitive to, we really want to be growing the protocol with quality. And I think drop the gate we'd be overwhelmed with like low quality and spammy posts pretty quickly. And so having kind of like strategy for making that work within Warpcast, our own client, but more importantly, that if you were to go build on the protocol, you don't have to spend a significant amount of engineering effort rebuilding your own version of like spam filters. So I think trying to think through how we can actually make it a primitive that lives at the protocol level, or kind of a kind of out of the box experience for a new developer, that's going to have a significant impact on developer adoption. Kind of once the protocol is completely permissionless. So I think like to go all the way back in terms of how we've built the developer community, it was build an initial version of the protocol and the initial product. It took us a year before anyone started building on anything, and we didn't even have developer APIs. It was kind of people reverse engineering stuff. But because the V1 protocol, despite it being pretty MVP, was still an actual protocol, people were able to permissionlessly do that. And I think where we are now is kind of 2.5 years in, we're finally at the point where we're really investing in the developer experience in terms of like documentation, this kind of like hubs and things like that. And so I've kind of given advice to people who are thinking about building protocols that developers up front and just kind of building features, hoping they show up, is probably a much harder path and less likely to succeed versus whatever protocol you're trying to build. Do actually the hard work of building the initial app and getting your first users for the protocol. And I think that in of itself is much more attractive to developers, right? Like developers don't care about your technology. They care about, are people using your technology? And then they'll evaluate your technology second, in the sense that like, okay, can I build anything interesting with this? But they don't start with interesting technology, what can I build? they start with like, oh, there's a bunch of people using this. Let me go build something and see if I can convince the existing people who are using this to use it. And that I think applies to all blockchains. And so there's this kind of like meme that I don't quite understand. I have a theory on it. It's like if you're someone who is maybe a little bit more systems thinking oriented and deterministic, the idea of like having to convince fickle humans to use something sounds really messy and hard, which it is. And so you'd much rather just like build the elegant technical piece of software or protocol and then just kind of be grumpy that people should be using it because it's so great. But that's just like not how the world works. And so I think that's the best way to get developers to use your thing, especially a protocol, is have users actually using the thing when they show up.
I think those are good points. And there's a comparison I want to make in regards to what you're saying to the early days of Twitter, since we kind of brought that up, and the developer community that existed there and how it was integrated. A lot of those functions or features were integrated into the main app, which is kind of what you guys are striving to shy away from. It sounds more like that you want the developer community to retain a sense of ownership of some of those things. However, obviously, if a feature is really attractive, then any of those developers could integrate that into their offering. So it'll be a little competitive in that way. Everybody will use the protocol, but which client or versions of clients or features of clients become attractive becomes a UI UX sort of thing.
I think there's two ways of thinking about this. So the first is the initial set of apps are going to be very influenced by the kind of reference application. And in that case, that's Warpcast. And so I think you're going to have a lot of people building either kind of like riffs on that, and in terms of just thinking like, okay, well, this is the feed that Warpcast has. I should be able to display it similarly, or maybe I add a little bit of features here or there. And then similarly, I think infrastructure tends to be either a low enough level primitive that it's generalizable, or it tends to be a little bit more targeted towards like the shape of what Warpcast is Twitter. So I'm going to build tools that would be useful for people who want to use something like Twitter. I think where the protocol steps up to a new level and thing that I'm actually quite excited for is when people start to look at the primitives and say, well, there's nothing stopping me from building a completely different type of social network that isn't around short text-based posts and is maybe more visual or more I don't know, even interactive in the sense that like just having everything be either reply or reaction. Maybe you start to extend the protocol and you say, hey, we're actually going to have this be, I don't know, a transaction or an agreement or you could even imagine interactions that kind of start to look more like a game. But the underlying primitive of the kind of like verifiable identity that has some auditable history, so you can kind of like verify like is this the real Dan Romero or not, and all the infrastructure for distributing the kind of like packets is the wrong term. We use the term messages, but if you just kind of think of Farcaster, it's like no, it's just like a blockchain in the sense that like it's a generalizable thing that if I put a piece of data into it, into the kind of network of hubs, it's going to propagate across the network. And then any application can permissionlessly look at the data and say, this data is interesting to me, this data is not interesting to me. And so the analogy I like to point out is in Ethereum, if you are building something that has something to do with NFTs, right? Like OpenSea, you just care about all the stuff that happens on the Ethereum blockchain that has an ERC 721 or an ERC 1155 designation, and you can ignore everything else, right? Whereas in the case of I don't know DeFi Llama or something like that, or DeFi Pulse, you're just like all I care about are ERC20s and like how that all plays together. And so I think that is where the social network protocol, and whether it's Farcast or something else, that's where it starts to take off, is where you have now parallel instances of social networks that don't necessarily need to be overlapping with each other, but still have some amount of shared identity primitive, because that actually in of itself is I think useful, right? And they can share some of that infrastructure, because it's like, why do you need to go rebuild that? Getting 100 unique hubs running, up and running, and then having to do that if, like, okay, you want to build Twitter versus someone wants to build Instagram. Now you have to go get, multiple people to run different hubs. That seems silly, versus the ability to kind of just share some thin layer of infrastructure, and then you kind of have unique experiences built on top of that. In the same way that, like, imagine if there was an NFT Ethereum, and then there was an ERC20, ERC20 DeFi Ethereum. That kind of sounds silly. It's just like, well, why don't you just have like one global computer that you can kind of go do this on? And in our view, if we could have done everything on chain within some reasonable amount of cost and UX, great. It's just like, why have to go reinvent the wheel? But I think from our point of view, in kind of approaching it from first principles, is the identity is actually worth putting on a blockchain and dealing with that level of friction and cost, because it actually puts it into a kind of type of computer that can't be mucked with, by any one individual company, country, organization, right? Like, you truly own your Farcaster identity, as a result of it just living in an Ethereum smart contract, right? And like, you need to make sure that smart contract doesn't have any backdoors or admin keys, but that's achievable, right? You can deploy a non-upgradable smart contract. Whereas the social layer, like the actual like replies and likes and profiles, for us, that is it's more ephemeral. Like, I think people don't worry about like the permanence of some of that stuff. And if you really care about it, you just have your own website. But I think for the average person on using any one of these networks, it's like they care about that authenticity, the identity. So getting that right is really important. But otherwise, people are actually willing to, I don't know, like, trade off a bunch of things if they can get speed and convenience. And so that's what we've really tried to optimize. The like Farcaster L2 is not the right term, but like the off-chain data structure that is Farcaster and Farcaster hubs is really focus on getting authenticity, of the post, in terms of like anyone can actually verify that this was in fact, the person who has the username DWR within the Farcaster identity system. But then everything else is really optimized for kind of like speed, convenience, and that's actually more than anything, it's targeted at developers, right? So it's like, get up and running with a new Farcaster client pretty easily, and then have full, access to the global state of the network. In the same way that an Ethereum node actually, does that pretty well. Granted, Ethereum nodes take a while to sync now, because they actually preserve all of history. If Farcaster actually has kind of like a bounded limit per user, so hubs are actually a much simpler thing to run. But yeah, that's generally how I think about it.
What do you think the strengths of the Warpcast network are in comparison to other social networks that aren't centralized? For example, we saw Mastodon get pretty popular last year as a federated model, and more recently, kind of seeing Blue Sky get a little bit of attention, as they've moved into test flight with their iOS app and things like that.
I think you're going to have many different attempts at protocols, for social, and actually relative to other instances. I think that social protocols, like, there's a decent chance that you have many, and many being defined as, like, call it a 10 or 20, maybe closer to 10, than like the web, which is effectively, it's like the web one, and like that's it. Or email is kind of like the only real messaging protocol, right? Like, you have big messaging apps. But I think, if you just look at these Web 2 social networks, right? Instagram and Twitter, like, in theory, like, you can make Twitter do all the stuff that Instagram does, but it just, again, goes back to this idea of like canonical clients who shape the kind of like shelling point for development on that network. And then in the case of like Instagram, there is no such thing as a third party client. But I think if I was to guess, like what will happen is that there'll probably be a winning at scale, decentralized version of what Twitter does today. There will be one of those. But I think, again, going back to this idea that like whether it's Farcaster or something else, there's a large idea space in terms of like what you can go build. And my hope is that actually, rather than just trying to replace what already exists, is you actually get the net new. Like humans are infinitely creative, in my opinion, and like there will always be new ways for people to want to express themselves and connect with each other. And part of the fun, I think, of a new social network is maybe a new social primitive. And so my hope is, rather than kind of being like very focused on the frame of like, okay, well, Elon has Twitter, and then there are kind of a bunch of Twitter alternatives, and like which one replaces it and or wins, is like fine that there's probably some version of that where that happens. But I think the far more interesting thing to focus on, and like some areas that we're just thinking about, at least from a protocol level, are what can you actually do to expand the Overton window for what you can do with social networks. And a good example of this, if you can make the assumption at a root level that every user has a working public and private key pair, in this case, an Ethereum address, which is what people on Farcaster are required to have. One, there's just like a bunch of end-to-end encrypted types of experiences that you can start to offer permissionlessly as a developer, because you know everyone who's on this network can satisfy that requirement. And they already have it, right? Like you don't have to get them to start up a new thing, back up a key, like, you know, all that stuff. Like every single person that ends up using Farcaster for a prolonged period of time and has successfully backed up their key. And we've had plenty of people lose their key. So like thinking about the UX on that has been a challenge, but I think we have ways to improve it. But every single person you kind of like onboard into that new reality becomes now an addressable user for a future developer who kind of wants to build an experience like that. And then thinking a little further out, you get to a place where zero knowledge proofs are an area where there's a ton of research that's going in. Like we're starting to see some kind of like practical applications of them as it relates to social. So there's a project by one of our kind of friends, Lakshman Shankar, who is working on an anonymous way for people to discuss governance proposals within the Noun ecosystem. So, you know, Nouns are an NFT project. They are pretty active in terms of like voting on things to spend the kind of project's treasury on. And one of these cool things is like you can actually have a verified noun owner. So I don't have to tell you which noun I own, but I can just prove that I actually have a noun and an address, and then be able to publish a message that is guaranteed to be anonymous, in the sense that I there's no central server that is this promising not to leak the information. It's just like you can just magically do that with encryption. And so I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on that idea space. And as the kind of like tooling and just like widespread use of ZKs increases, I would imagine you're going to get new types of speech that pop up. And the analogy I always pull from history is a foundational part of the ratification of the Constitution in the United States were the Federalist Papers, which were a series of anonymous newspaper op-eds written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in a New York newspaper. And they were under the pseudonym Publius. And yes, you can have those things exist without, you know, cryptographic primitives, but they're vastly, you know, simplified and or superior from a permissionless standpoint to be able to just like build a system that would allow that for that to happen, where I could basically take some credential that exists on a blockchain over here, and it doesn't even need to exist on a blockchain. It could just be any cryptographic credential that people can at least go look at and say, yep, this speech is actually verified to have come from an individual that controls the private key that's associated with this credential. And so I think that is an area that I get pretty excited about. And so if you start to like then compare like, okay, Farcaster versus, you know, one of the more federated versions of social media, that's tied to DNS and doesn't require every user to have a public and private key as the kind of like the base identity primitive, then I think you start to, if you just kind of extrapolate out, I think they start to diverge in terms of like what is actually possible in terms of what can be built.
So let me ask you this. In addition to hubs, what are some of the notable developments or advances for the Farcaster protocol or Warpcast network that you're looking forward to for the remainder of 2023?
Well, the milestones I mentioned, getting hubs out to a permissionless state, right? I think there's a mental model I have is if someone has an interesting idea to build in social, what is the boot up time from I have the idea to I have a working V1 of, some amount of that idea implemented? And I think that the shorter that time, and there's ways to shave off minutes every part of the process, but it's kind of like, okay, I go to the Farcaster homepage, I click the protocol, I download the hub, get it into, my infrastructure, get it spun up, start developing against it. There's just like a lot of work to get all that done, but that needs to happen. And I think that the kind of like core identity primitive needs to actually prove to people rather than me telling people that like, hey, this is going to be this incredibly neutral identity layer that when you actually have an FID and a Farcaster username, it's something that is sovereignly owned by you and no one else. Uh, it's kind of hard to make that argument when you're still on testnet. And so getting those contracts to a kind of blockchain like Ethereum that is decentralized and provides, I think, kind of like a world-class security guarantee, right? It's like I think that there are two blockchains that exist today, Bitcoin and Ethereum, that reach that kind of like, if you go deploy something on it, in the case of Bitcoin, it's like your actual Bitcoin that you hold, and on Ethereum, it's a smart contract. There's no practical way for people to go muck with it. And I know there's plenty of tinfoil hat people would be like, oh, well, the Ethereum Foundation, if they fork it and like, look at what happened with the DAO hack. But like, okay, like I don't want to argue with those people. If that's what you believe, great. Like from my standpoint, an Ethereum smart contract is pretty ironclad in terms of you have to live with the programming. So if there's an exploit in it, like that's your own issue. But in terms of if you were to write a sufficiently well-constructed contract, that contract's going to run the same way as long as Ethereum continues to kind of have the core promise of what the EVM is. And so getting the core identity primitive onto chain is important. And then I think the last thing, which is, I've had an evolving perspective on this, is getting to permissionless signups. I think for a while I was kind of saying, hey, we want to actually be permissioned for the first 1 million users, right? Like we're not in a rush to kind of like grow too fast because I think we're trying to grow with quality and solve problems along the way. But I think where I've maybe evolved a little bit is there is just like this mental blocker for people if they have to like, the classic one with Farcaster is for a while it was like DM me for an invite. But the idea is like, oh wait, I can't just like programmatically do stuff, and I have to like there is still kind of like one bit of, call it corporate infrastructure, that is a kind of like choke point. I think that there's a lot of latent developer interest that gets turned off by that, at least within crypto, right? Like because we are approaching early users who tend to be a little bit more ideological or there because they believe in the future, but like I think developers, rightfully so, have been burned over the last decade of these different development platforms, which is whether it's like Facebook changing their rules, Twitter's changing their APIs.
Right.
I think even the App Store, where it feels like the mobile app stores have gotten more restrictive and extractive. Right, like you can't link to OpenSea in a mobile app. And that's just like an arbitrary rule that Apple decides, and it's their right to do it. Right, like that they control the App Store because they built the iPhone. But I think getting to a place where a developer can look at Farcaster, read through all the code, understand the white paper, look at the smart contracts on chain, and then actually say, oh, interesting. If I build on this, the risk that I get, quote, rugged as a developer is extremely low. Okay, I'm actually going to go willing to invest significant time and energy into building on this. And so I think that is the thing I weigh off against like growing more slowly and with quality is getting to a permissionless state and then actually just trying to solve for the things, the downsides of that, right? So the downsides of that is the, bunch of low quality scams, spam, that kind of stuff starts to pop up on the network, which if you don't manage it at the client level and or think about how to make it for other clients, it just kind of like makes the network not attractive to build on. And I think one thing to consider is like, despite the app store's kind of pain in the ass process, the app store kind of doing a good job making sure that there aren't any like scammy and malicious apps on average, right? Like in the sense that you've had probably some sneak through, but for the most part not. A has just like made mobile just like this amazing platform where like you have billions of people using mobile devices who otherwise probably would have never installed any software on a computer because it would have just been too hard. And so you've massively increased the addressable market for if I build a piece of software, I can actually now ship it to literally billions of people around the world. But that's a result of putting a quality bar of like it's gated to get on there. And so that's where I was going to go back and forth is like it's against the crypto ethos of permissionless public blockchains. It's the thing that I got into originally. But if you actually want to build something that has, quote, billions of people using it, then I think thinking deeply about like kind of like what is that average user experience and how do you make it as high quality as possible? Because that average user doesn't actually care about the ethos and or the ideology, but they care about is just like the user experience. And so if you can get the best of both worlds where it's like somehow you've put some default quality bar while still having it be permissionless and I don't know if that's even possible, but like that's the thing to try to solve for, because then what you get is permissionless innovation increases the total aggregate number of apps, and the average user gets the benefit of all those apps without having to like be kind of confused and or worried that they're going to get some malware on their computer. And I actually think that the best analogy here is the web is the best example of this, right? It's like you usually don't have to worry other than very extreme cases and very rare 0 day, and you'd have to be really targeted. But if I click a link, I know that it's not going to mess up my computer. Where you can have things get messed up is you inputting information like a phishing site or something. But you know that like clicking a link is not dangerous. There was that earlier era when you had like crazy pop-ups and all that stuff, but that's basically been solved. And so now what's interesting about a link is like it just becomes this really easy thing. Anyone's willing to kind of go do it and try it. And if you run into something you don't like, the back button is just like click, and then you're there. And so I think the web is probably the best example of that like kind of mix of permissionlessness. Anyone can go set up and start a website mixed with like really, really nice user experience on average. And I think that's what we want to kind of try to achieve with Farcaster as a social network.
Are there any remaining points that you want to make that you feel like we haven't touched on yet?
I think one thing that I go back and forth on is this idea that social networks, the only ones that work grow virally, and it happens in kind of like lightning in a bottle moments. And I think that it's a little bit more of a messy history. It's like certain social networks took a while to figure out kind of their form factor. I'm pretty sure Pinterest is very different than where it kind of found its first niche of people that were interested in it. Facebook is even another good example. Yes, it grew really fast within the communities that it originally targeted, but it was sign up gated for 2.5 years. And if you go back and read the contemporaneous writing about Facebook, it was lumped as the college social network.
Right.
And the assumption at the time was like, oh, well, MySpace was getting, got bought for 800 million or whatever. And it was that much bigger. And so I think it's almost like people fell into some lazy thinking in the last few years of thinking that social networks, the way they grow is like, oh, well, because they're social and they have some K factor, like they blow up, right? Like Snapchat blew up, TikTok blew up. Instagram, sort of like there was a version of Instagram that didn't work, and then they iterated and got to one that did start to work. And so I also think like YouTube was a very different network in the first kind of 5 years, maybe even 10 years of its existence compared to where it is now. And so I think that these things tend to be a lot more dynamic, and they can change. And I think where, I would love Farcaster to be growing really, really fast. But at the same time, there is something to be said for it's 2023. So you're not pioneering social media. Like you, in some ways, it's actually a pretty mature category. And so you have to have thought through a lot of different things that relative to when, whether it's Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or Instagram got started, they didn't have to deal with, because if anything, people were kind of making fun of people for using it. It's like, oh, Twitter, like you're going to post a photo of what you had for lunch, like eating a sandwich. Haha, it's so stupid. 10 years later, this is an existential threat to democracy. It needs to be, regulated and controlled. And oh my God, like we can't allow one person to own Twitter. It's a public company. Like, so the narrative can be very different at the beginning when everyone thinks it's kind of stupid. And if you just kind of continue to make progress over a long enough period of time, that's a big F. You got to stay motivated and actually continue to build stuff that people want to use. But if that does happen, I think growth can happen in those out years, even if it didn't necessarily go viral right up front. And so, and especially if you kind of abstract Farcaster into, yes, we are building both a protocol, but our team at least is also building a social app. All right, Warpcast and kind of like that, the shape of that. I think there's a version of things where, I want to make Warpcast as successful as possible, because I actually think that it's a really great way to drive growth of the Farcaster protocol. But I also see a version of this where Warpcast continues to make progress, albeit not necessarily a breakout success as a kind of like independent social app, but in our efforts over the next couple of years to continue to grow, especially with quality, the core of the protocol. That's actually if you're going to look back on it, it was like, this is actually what kicked off the growth of Farcaster as a protocol. And so I don't want to resign to saying, no, we're never going to be able to figure it out with Warpcast. It's like, no, I actually think that is the most likely and fastest path to making Farcaster a success. And so we're going to continue to invest in it. But I do think that with these protocols, it just sometimes they take time. And I think one of the downsides to crypto is because of the ease of financialization up front. You get these situations where people talk a big game, promise a lot, then all of a sudden everything's financialized before a lot of the stuff is built. And I think it really becomes difficult to stay motivated for some of these teams when it's like, okay, well, why? I already got, if they were there only for the money, like I already got the money. So like, why am I continuing to do that? And so I think where, for me, the experience at Coinbase is useful in that you continue to build because there's something on the horizon that you're looking forward to. And in the case, I think for Warpcast is like, yes, there's a financial component. Like we hope to make money with Warpcast, but there's also a version of it is if I can 10, 20, 30 years from now, look back and say, actually, we were fundamental in shifting internet social into a protocol-based world. And all of these new apps and services that got built on top of these credibly neutral protocols are a result of us kind of like starting that the kindling of the fire that ends up becoming kind of the decentralized protocol-based social. That would be something I'd be really proud of. And so I think just having a longer term time horizon on that is I don't know, something that I think a lot about relative to if you were to ask most people in kind of like Web 2 building a centralized social company. It's like, if the thing isn't taking off, you should be, kind of constantly iterating and, potentially shifting to the next idea versus I know what I want to build, and it's just going to take time to continue to grow it.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, looking forward to seeing what develops and how it evolves throughout the year. Obviously, I'm using Warpcast pretty regularly. I'm on there at least every couple of days. Appreciate you taking the time to elaborate more on it and give us a little bit of the roadmap today, Dan.
Thanks for having me.